Good afternoon, everyone, or late morning. So I've got a few slides to run through, and I just want to talk about some of the bigger trends that I've seen and learned about recently in the world and how they relate back to open source and cloud computing, and hopefully spur a little bit of discussion. So just opening with a quote that many of you are probably familiar with, which is from William Gibson. Over 20 years ago, he said, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. So I don't know if you've heard this quote before, but I think it's a pretty insightful thought. And however, it's also kind of sad to think that the best technologies of our time are not available to everyone, or the best economic opportunities are not available to everyone on the planet. That some of us are very lucky to be in countries that have more economic opportunity, and others haven't had the same opportunities that we've all had. And so I'm actually an optimist, and I fundamentally believe that 20 years from now the future will be evenly distributed, much more so at least than it is today. And I think open source has a lot to do with that. And this increase in adoption in open source, it makes fundamental technologies available to people all over the world, and the access to them is also increasing. So I really just want to talk about distributed, what distributed means, all the different places we see this trend taking place, and why it's a great time to be alive for all of us on the planet. There are many headlines that you may see that will speak to all the bad things going on in the world, but I like to look at the trend lines over the headlines sometimes and see where there's actually a lot of hope and things to consider about our future world that are actually quite exciting. So for example, over the next 6 years, another 1 billion people will come online. So if you want access to technology, you want access to information, you want access to open source, you need to be online, right? So another 1 billion human beings will be online. And I think just as profound as that sounds and is, the fact is that they will be connected with smartphones as well. So they're not just going to be online, they're going to be online and they're going to be mobile. And so that's just 6 years from now. And if we think 20 years out, I think we see a few signs of what this kind of shift means politically and economically, and to each of us individually. We'll, I think, agree that it's a pretty powerful thing. And this opportunity is not limited to just a few of Western countries or of the countries that are richer today. There's a projection that in 5 years from now, in fact, 2/3 of sub-Saharan Africa will be covered with 3G connectivity. And certainly it's not going to happen overnight, and there are many other areas that need to be improved in the lives of people all over the world, particularly in Africa. So I'm not trying to paint an overly rosy picture here, but I think if you look at the trend, it's a very positive one, and I think it's one in which we will actually look back and see that the future is becoming more and more evenly distributed, and that's a great thing for humanity. And when you think about that power being in connectivity as well as being a smartphone, if you look at what those smartphones are, they're much more powerful than they used to be. And in fact, everybody gets a supercomputer today. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Oprah, but she's pretty big, so you might have heard of her. But this statistic is one that I recently read in an Andreessen Horowitz report. And basically, the statistic is that on iPhone launch weekend, Apple, just over that weekend, sold 25 times more transistors than all PCs on Earth in 1995. So that's a tremendous amount of power that's going into people's pockets. But it's not just power in the sense that it's compute power and transistors and the ability to crunch numbers. It's actually about the power to affect change and make the society we want. It's about economic power, It's actually power on several different levels. And it's not just the $1,000 iPhone that not everyone can afford. Smartphones are also becoming much more accessible. So Google recently launched the Android One in India, which is about $100 US. And there's a Firefox phone, which is available for $35. These are in US dollars. But I can try to do the euro conversion for you, but they're getting a lot cheaper. And so at the end of the day, what I'm really saying is that when you combine ubiquitous connectivity, which we all enjoy every day right now, but it's rapidly coming to the rest of the world, that next billion people in 5 years, 6 years, that's huge. When you combine that with a pocket supercomputer, you're getting distributed power. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of the ways this power is manifesting itself in the world. Not just in terms of cloud computing and technology and playing games on mobile phones, but really changing the world. So this graph shows the interest in an application called FireChat. Have any of you ever heard of FireChat? So this is an application that few people had heard of at the time that actually allows peer-to-peer connections between phones even when the internet is down. And so this peaked in interest when the Hong Kong protests were happening just a few weeks ago. And so what's happening here is that people in these crowds are actually able to, oops, I think I skipped ahead. Sorry. Oh, darn it. Okay. Well, there's my next punchline. It didn't animate like I thought it would. Okay, so anyway, the people, of course, in Hong Kong, even when the internet was being, difficult to use to organize and to give, back a strong message to their government that they wanted something different, they were actually able to route around that because of the power that was in their hands. And in Hungary, not far from here, there was recently a proposed tax. Have any of you familiar with this? Have you heard about this tax? Okay, so people in masses came out to protest against this tax. That's kind of amazing to me. I mean, I was shocked to see the images of how many people said, you are not going to add an additional tax to my internet connectivity. And the reason is because that is the power, right? That is the power to connect individually. It's a fundamental fabric of democracy today, is to be able to assemble. So they used that very internet, the one that was supposed to be taxed, to organize, get the word out, and get on the streets. And, the politicians were forced to reverse course. And so the question you have to ask yourself, this is just in the last 2 weeks, is, who really has the power right now? Is it the person in the suit, or is it all the people in the streets? And you may notice they're all holding up their phones. I think this is a pretty big deal. I'm not even sure a year ago this would have happened. So things are happening very rapidly because of the spread of connectivity, because of the spread of phones. And of course, eventually you knew I would get around to talking about cloud. These are cloud-connected devices. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how it relates to OpenStack. But at the end of the day, there's just this massive swell of change in our lifetimes that we're going to look back on and realize just changed everything about our planet. And I think, for the better. And if you take another example where technology or economic progress, there are some signs of optimism, reasons to be optimistic, not just about protesting your government, but also just spreading economic opportunity. That Bill Gates, who many of us in the open source world probably weren't big fans of back when he was Microsoft, and maybe we were supporting open source, but he's gone on and used his billions for a lot of good. I'm personally very impressed with what he's done since he's sort of left the Microsoft world and moved to charity work. And he put out this excellent report. I highly recommend you read it, basically showing some important data points where there's reason for optimism around the world. And so on the left is a picture of Nairobi from 1969, and on the right is a picture of the same city in 2009. Now, I'm not here to tell you that every problem's been solved in Africa, or everybody has a great opportunity or a great standard of living in Africa. That's obviously not the case today. But I think if you look at the trend, it's a positive one, and I think technology and access to connectivity and open source are absolutely key drivers. So if any of you are working on these areas, I think you should be proud at some of the other consequences, the positive side effects, if you will, of some of the things that we work on. I know I am very proud to be involved in an open source project that's helping generate jobs in China. I mean, I have been able to meet some very passionate entrepreneurs who went on to go start companies in China just to create OpenStack products and services, and they're creating jobs in areas of the world where wages are very, very low and people are being lifted up. And open source can be an agent of change for that. So I've been talking about humanity. This is a little bit more of an IT conference, so I promised Jonathan I would at least talk a little bit about IT and not just give you my personal views on economics. So this trend towards distributed everything is absolutely happening in IT as well. So back in the day, everything was centralized, right? Central planning was the name of the game in IT, and in fact, you were simply told by IT, your Windows machine is ready, Dave. That's it. That's not really the case today in a lot of companies. The power, the decision making is moving out to the edges. Business units are making more decisions, and individuals in those business units are making more decisions about what kind of laptops they want, what kind of phones they want, what kind of cloud services they want. I mean, I think the decision chain has, and the sort of chain of authority, if you will, has been radically changed by things like Amazon and other public clouds, where all you actually need is a credit card, and you've got yourself some resources to do something for your business. That's both, exciting and driving innovation, but also very, very frightening for a lot of IT managers. And so, regardless of how you feel about it, I mean, it is happening. And, if you really just kind of summarize the trends that I see, it's really distributed is beating monolithic. Distributed beats monolithic. It's distributed power. It's happening all over the world. And so when we take a step down to cloud computing and we think about where we are today with cloud computing and whether or not we're actually part of this trend, I think we have to acknowledge that there is a monolith in the room, okay, in cloud computing. I mean, I don't think we should pretend that there isn't. There is. It's of course Amazon. The monolith in the room is Amazon, and they have amazing technology, and they are actually helping a lot of companies move faster. And so I have nothing but respect for Amazon, but the fact of the matter is that Amazon is not enough. No one company is enough. And the code that powers Amazon is not open source, so you can't really take it with you. You can access that power by the hour with a credit card, but you can't really take it with you. And in any event, I just don't fundamentally believe the power of cloud is going to be limited to one company. I just think that cloud will not be immune to this trend. And so, one of the great ironies of cloud computing is that cloud is a distributed technology, right? I mean, a cloud application is distributed, technically, right, across many different machines. So we've had a world where the architecture was distributed, but not the power. And, frankly, I think it's fair to say that Amazon has dominated. And if you look at the headlines, they'll certainly back that up, right? I mean, Amazon dominates. I mean, this is what you hear everywhere, right? Amazon's dominating. And look, they are out to an amazing lead They're in a lot of different countries. They have a lot of business, a lot of customers. But if you take a little bit closer look, you know, the thing that these quotes all have in common is that they're all from 2013. And, you know, this industry moves very quickly. The power of a distributed team, like an open source community, is a great one. I do not believe that cloud will be immune to this trend of distributed power. And I think OpenStack is a bit of an example of that. And some of the facts around how adoption is growing is due to this distributed team and distributed R&D that is different than the monolithic approach. And so, you know, if one monolithic provider was enough, you know, we wouldn't all be here looking at and learning about different technologies, right? And so if we actually look at some more recent data, you know, those headlines were from 2013. And as I mentioned before, I think sometimes it's better to not so much look at the headlines as the trend lines, which is, by the way, a Bill Clinton quote that I'm ripping off. But what can I say? He's got good lines. So this is showing a little bit more recent data. So if you look at this, this is Google Trends, which is essentially interest people are showing. It's based on searches on Google, right? So if you look at this trend line, I think you'll see that, you know, interest in OpenStack, which again is not a company, is not any one company. It is a distributed effort across thousands of developers and hundreds of companies. You know, we're on a pretty good trajectory here relative to the de facto leader in cloud. And at our summit this week, at the OpenStack Summit, you know, we heard from some very big brands, some very big companies like BMW and Time Warner Cable and BBVA, companies that are building OpenStack private clouds because Amazon is not enough, a public cloud is not enough for them. They need it in their data center for many different reasons, for legacy architecture, for data, for privacy, for security, and they're all running OpenStack, and that's, you know, very attractive to them to be able to take the power with them and bring it in-house. And, you know, this is not a big surprise. We know that software is eating the world is another famous quote from Mark Andreessen, and, you know, that means that it's fundamentally a different world. And so, of course, there are going to be many different strategies, many different models, and one size is not going to fit all. And so what we're doing is moving into a world where, you know, of course, we have distributed computing, but we also have distributed vendors. You know, we have over 400 organizations supporting OpenStack. Distributed model, by that I mean public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud. Hosted private cloud is another interesting category. If you're not familiar with that, it's actually quite a growing area. And OpenStack enables all these things because it's open source, right? So anybody can take the software, it's Apache licensed, they can turn it into a business, they can take it internally, they can pretty much do anything they want with it, which enables many different models. And of course, it is being adopted in many different verticals, whether it's, you know, auto manufacturers. We have 2 of the top 10 auto manufacturers in the world using OpenStack. We have most of the top banks in the world are now using OpenStack. You know, web companies, e-commerce, you know, many different verticals. And they can customize it to their needs because it's open source. And ultimately, you know, I like to think of the reason why it works is because it's distributed R&D. You know, no one company can possibly have the same impact that 100 or 200 companies working together can have. It's just not possible. You know, there's a lot of great companies in the world, but if they would let down their guard and sort of come join us, you know, they would find that we could all move faster together. And that's exactly what's happening. I mean, we've had over 2,000 developers contribute from 100 companies from countries all over the world. And so, you know, we see this distributed community on every level really coming together. And so, you know, we've always felt that power will be distributed, and in fact, it is distributed. I think we're very close to that tipping point right now. And if we look at, you know, a couple more pieces of data, I like to present data, especially on maps. because it looks pretty. But this is a map. Does anybody know what these dots represent? Okay, so these are Amazon data centers, or regions, availability zones. These are places in the world where Amazon has a cloud. And again, very impressive company. They have an incredibly powerful technology. And at first blush, you may think, well, they're kind of everywhere, right? They're on every continent just about. I mean, it seems like they're kind of everywhere. But the reality is they're, if you're in 10 countries, there are 200 countries in the world. You're really not everywhere. And if somebody needs a cloud in France, then building a cloud in Germany and saying, don't worry, we've got you covered, that's really not capacity, right? That's audacity for them to say, this is good enough for you. If you need a cloud in France, you need a cloud in France, for whatever reasons, data sovereignty, et cetera. And so the next data point shows you where all of the OpenStack powered public clouds are today. And there are many more coming online over the next year. But we have 2 public clouds in France. We have multiple public clouds in Germany, multiple public clouds in the UK. And throughout North America, there's Hong Kong, Guangdong, Beijing. I mean, there are many different places where there are OpenStack public clouds today. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think when you distribute the code and you distribute the teams and you have a distributed number of vendors, in other words, anyone can play, it's very powerful. And then the last data point that I think really helps drive home this idea that when you put the power in the hands of the users to take it where they want to take it, they will take it all over the world. In fact, this actually shows you where all the private OpenStack clouds are, just the ones we know about, people that took our user survey. So there are a lot more that we don't know of because it's open source. They don't necessarily tell us. But if you just take people who've taken our survey and said, I have an OpenStack private cloud, this is where I'm running it, this is what it looks like. So I think that cloud computing is not in any way immune to this distributed trend, and we're seeing that it's a great thing. People have that access to that power. And the last thing I wanted to mention is just that it seems like maybe I've been bashing on Amazon. I actually have nothing but respect for Amazon. The press sometimes likes to make everybody enemies and say, this is the enemy of this, and we're at war, and use all these big superlatives or these strong words or hyperbolic language. But I think that human beings, actually have no natural predators, and I think OpenStack similarly has no enemies. We don't actually, open source is not anyone's enemy. This is actually something that people have a very hard time getting their head around. I think Cedric and I were talking about this just a minute ago. It seems like everybody feels they need to be for or against open source. But if you have a phone, you already are carrying around some open source. If you use a browser, you're using open source. I mean, if you use Facebook, you're using open source. I mean, open source is powering all sorts of things. So you essentially can't be against open source. I mean, you can, I guess. You're right, have a right to your opinion. But OpenStack certainly doesn't consider anyone an enemy. We consider our users, the people who we want to have economic opportunity. And by being open source and Apache licensed, anybody can run it. People even run OpenStack on Amazon. There's a company at our summit that was demonstrating this. So there's really no barriers, and there really are no enemies. And much like people say, humans have no natural predators. Really, we only have to fear each other, right? So as long as we all work together, we'll be fine. And lastly, if you look at OpenStack itself, it is a distributed architecture, as cloud tends to be, and we have different services, whether it's database as a service or block storage network. And I think over time, we do kind of test it together in a somewhat of a monolithic fashion. I mean, we test it as one integrated release, is what we call it. But I think that will change too. I think in 2 or 3 years from now, it'll become easier and easier to sort of pick and choose which pieces of OpenStack you want and have strong API contracts between them and be able to kind of mix and match. And our users are already doing this, but I think that we can do a better job of serving the needs of people who don't want necessarily all of OpenStack for their cloud. They just want one piece. So the trend can go all the way down to the code. And the last few slides really are kind of speaking to our summit. You know, at the summit this week in Paris, we had attendees from 60 different countries. So this map just shows you where all the people came from who flew to Paris, to your amazing, gorgeous city, who, you know, of course, can't have a bad time in Paris. So we brought a lot of people here, and what's exciting is they're going to go home and bring with them a lot of knowledge. They're going to help distribute that power, right? They're going to help make the future more evenly distributed by going back to these countries with the knowledge they gained from the summit, with the participation, the people they met, with the code improvements and the software. And I think that's why open source is probably one of the biggest enablers of leveling the playing field in the world, which as a humanitarian, personally, I think that's a really great thing. Last but not least, just to get a plug in for our future summits, you know, we had this one in Paris this week. You know, we were in Portland 18 months ago. We went to Hong Kong, which was our first summit outside of the United States, which was a great indicator of things to come. You know, it's a distributed community. It is by no means an American dominated project. It is very much a global project. You know, we went to Atlanta and Paris. And what's exciting about next year is that we're going to be going to Vancouver in May of 2015. And then in October, you know, our summits are twice a year, for those of you who aren't familiar with the format. So twice a year we get together as a community. So we'll be going to Vancouver, Canada in May, and then in October we'll be going to Tokyo. And so what's really cool about that, in my opinion, is that at that point we will have had 3 consecutive summits outside of the United States, which is absolutely as it should be for such a distributed project. And that's our commitment to being where our community is, but also bringing them with us to many new places. I mean, the fact that people came from 60 countries to come to Paris, France this week, I think is an amazing thing. And again, when they go back home, help us distribute the future a little more evenly, and maybe in 5 years, 10 years, we'll see, you know, that we're in a better world, and the monoliths will not win. So that's it. Thank you.